Welcome to a journey back to 18th century Lisbon, one of the most beautiful, influential, and wealthiest cities in the world. Before Paris or London claimed their modern dominance, Lisbon was the globe's gateway. It was a city where the air smelled of pepper and cinnamon, where the riches of Brazil paved the streets, and where every stone still echoed the age of discovery. Using advanced AI, we have transformed 18th century oil paintings, copperplate engravings, and sketches into photorealistic scenes. Today, you won't just hear history, you will see it. You will stand before the magnificent Ribera Palace, walk the bustling, narrow alleys of the Alfama, and witness the catastrophic event that changed European philosophy and architecture forever. By the early 1700s, nearly 200,000 people called Lisbon home. It was Europe's fourth largest city, trailing only Naples, Paris, and London. A city of extreme contrasts, it was. On one hand, it was the New Rome, filled with more than 90 convents and 40 churches. On the other, it was a chaotic, medieval labyrinth where the wealth of an empire flowed through streets lacking a modern sewage system. But this golden age was speeding toward a terrifying climax. We will see how a city was erased in a single morning and how it rose from its ashes to become the Enlightenment's first modern city. To understand why the world stood in shock when Lisbon fell, one must understand that, by 1750, this city was the beating heart of a global machine. This is the Tagus River, the lifeblood of an empire and the golden throat of Europe. In the mid-1700s, this wasn't just water, it was the wealthiest and most strategic harbor in the Atlantic. Looking at the 1730 engraving by Joachim Adens, we see a forest of masts so dense it was said you could almost cross the river by jumping from deck to deck. But why were all these ships here? To understand the sheer scale, we must look at the 5 pillars of Portuguese supremacy that made Lisbon the beating heart of a global machine. Daily, ships arrived, fueling what historians call the first truly global economy. The first pillar was the spice link. While other nations still struggled to establish trade, Portugal held the keys to the east. From Timor, Malacca, and Goa, ships brought the Orient's aromatic treasures, cloves, cinnamon, and pepper, directly into Lisbon's warehouses, where they were sold at a premium to the rest of a hungry Europe. Closer behind was the second pillar, the silk and porcelain route. Through the gateway of Macau, Lisbon held a near monopoly on white gold, the delicate Chinese porcelain that every aristocratic house in London and Paris craved. Then came the African connection. By controlling strategic ports in Mozambique and Angola, Lisbon dominated the Atlantic trade winds, funneling gold, rare woods, and ivory into the city's coffers. But the true engine of 18th century Lisbon, the fourth and most powerful pillar, was the age of gold, the Brazilian boom. After the 1695 discovery of massive gold deposits in Minas Gerais, a literal river of wealth began to flow across the Atlantic. The magnitude is hard to overstate. Nearly 1,000,000 tons of gold and millions of carats of diamonds arrived at these very docks in the decades leading up to the Great Disaster. This unimaginable wealth transformed Lisbon into a cultural and scientific magnet. The king didn't just hoard this gold, he invested it in prestige. He gathered a classified library of nautical maps, the roteiros, and commissioned the world's most advanced aqueducts. These maps were the 18th century equivalent of nuclear codes, containing the secret navigation data of the world's oceans. In 1750, Lisbon was the world's wealthiest creditor and its primary warehouse. Yet, the riverfront was a scene of stark, noisy contrast. You would hear a dozen languages, Italian, English, Dutch, and African dialects, mingling with the rough Portuguese of the stevedores. The Ribeira was the city's front door, and while it glittered with gold, it also reeked of reality. Unlike London or Paris, which were inland cities, Lisbon looked directly out into the deep blue, obsessed with the horizon. However, the beauty was deceptive. The Tagus was also the city's primary sewer. The stench of Lisbon was legendary among travelers. Domestic waste was thrown from windows into the streets and eventually washed down the hills into these very waters. Yet, this river provided both the diamonds that adorned the crowns of kings and the fish that fed the starving poor. Today, the Tagus remains the city's heart, but the heavy galleons have been replaced by sailboats and cruise liners. The Ribeira district, once the center of this global power, is now the Praça do Comércio, a site we will visit later to see how it was reborn from the ashes of European history's greatest tragedy. Imagine standing before the Paço da Ribeira. For over 250 years, this was the royal residence of the Portuguese kings. If Versailles was the symbol of French power, the Ribera Palace was the symbol of Portuguese global reach. Built originally by King Manuel in the early 1500s, it was constantly expanded. By the mid-1700s, it was a treasure house. Inside its walls were hundreds of paintings by masters like Rubens, Titian, and Correggio, more than 70,000 volumes in the Royal Library, and the priceless archives of the Age of Discovery, charts and maps that showed the secret routes to the east. King João spent his riches here with an intensity that rivaled Francis Louis XIV. It turned the Portuguese court into a spectacle of Baroque excess. He didn't just want to be a king, he wanted to be the most apostolic king. He used Brazilian gold to pay the Pope for the title of Eminent Highness and to turn the royal chapel into a place of shimmering silver and gold. But the palace was more than a home for the king. It was the administrative brain of an empire stretching from Indonesia to South America. In the lower floors, clerks tracked the weight of gold bars and the price of pepper. Today, this palace is completely gone. Not a single stone of the royal residence remains on this site. When we reach the year 1755 pulgadas our story, you will see why. Now, the space is occupied by the vast, open Praça do Comércio. To understand 18th century Lisbon, you must understand its relationship with God. This is the Jerónimos Monastery in the district of Belém. Even in the 1700s, it was already 200 years old, a masterpiece of Manueline architecture, a style unique to Portugal that incorporates maritime symbols like coral and ropes into the stone. The monastery was built with the pepper tax, the 5% levy on all goods coming from India. In the 18th century, it was the spiritual anchor of the city. Sailors would pray here before leaving on voyages that might last 3 years. The lucky ones who returned would come here to give thanks. Nearby stands the Belém Tower. In the 1700s, it sat much further out in the river than it does today. It was the first thing a sailor saw upon return and the last thing he saw when leaving Lisbon. It served as both a grim prison and a ceremonial gateway. In its damp, underground dungeons, criminals and political prisoners were held in horrific conditions, often forgotten as the tide rose. Further into the city stood the Carmel Convent. Towering over the Rocio Square, it was the most important Gothic church in Lisbon. Its height made it a landmark visible from almost anywhere in the city, and its library was legendary. The Catholic Church in Lisbon was omnipresent. There was a chapel or a church on almost every corner. The sound of bells was the city's heartbeat, marking the hours of prayer and the news of the day. But this religious devotion had a darker side, one that the Enlightenment thinkers of London and Paris looked upon with horror. This is the Rocio, the center of public life in Lisbon. While it was a place for celebrations and markets, in the 1700s, it was also the site of the auto da fe, the public penance of the Portuguese Inquisition. Portugal was a deeply religious and conservative society. The Inquisition, established in 1536, was still very active in the 18th century. They targeted new Christians, Jews who had been forced to convert but were suspected of practicing their old faith in secret, as well as those accused of sodomy, heresy, or witchcraft. While the Enlightenment was sweeping through the coffee houses of Paris, Lisbon was still burning people at the stake in the Rocio. These public executions were grand spectacles, attended by the nobility and the king. The victims would be paraded through the streets in San Benito's, yellow tunics with red crosses, before being brought to the fire. This religious fervor created a strange atmosphere in the city. It was a place of immense wealth and artistic beauty, yet it was also a place of intellectual repression and fear. Books were censored, and new ideas from the rest of Europe were often smuggled in like contraband. Today, the Rocio is a place of meeting and joy. The headquarters of the Inquisition was replaced by the Dona Maria II National Theatre. The dark history of the Inquisition is a shadow the city has long since stepped out of, but in the 1700s, it was a defining feature of daily life. If you left the grand palaces of the riverfront and climbed the hills, you entered a different world. This is the Alfama. It is the oldest district in Lisbon, a medieval maze that survived the Reconquest and the Moorish occupation. In the 1700s, life here was lived in the streets. Because the houses were so cramped and small, people socialized, washed, and cooked outside. You would see the barinas asterisco, fisquibis, carrying baskets of sardines on their heads, shouting their prices with a musical, rhythmic call. Lisbon had a serious water problem. There was no running water in houses. Instead, the city relied on public fountains. The heavy lifting was done by Gallegos, immigrants from Galicia and Spain. They were the city's muscle, carrying water barrels up the steep hills to the houses of the poor and the wealthy alike. They were often treated as a lower caste, yet the city could not function for a single day without them. On the opposite hill was the Bairro Alto. By day, it was a quiet neighborhood of craftsmen and aristocrats. By night, it became the center of Lisbon's nightlife. This was the birthplace of Fado, though in the 1700s, it was still evolving from the songs of the marginalized and sailors. You would hear the melancholic strings of the Portuguese guitar echoing through the darkness. But the darkness was dangerous. Criminality was high, and the night soul, the contents of chamber pots, was frequently emptied from windows with a simple cry of agua vai. Water goes. It was All Saints' Day. A major religious holiday. Almost the entire population of Lisbon was inside the churches, which were packed to capacity. The air was thick with incense, and thousands of candles were lit on the altars. At 9:40 de la mañana, the earth began to shake. This was not a small tremor. It was a massive undersea earthquake, later estimated to be between 8.5 and 9.0 on the Richter scale. The shaking lasted for nearly 6 minutes, an eternity during an earthquake. In the grand churches like the Cathedral, St. and the Carmel Convent, the heavy stone roofs collapsed instantly, crushing thousands of worshippers. The narrow streets of the Baixa and Alfama became death traps as buildings leaned and fell into one another. Those who survived the initial collapse ran toward the river. The Tagus was the only open space, away from the falling buildings. Thousands of people gathered on the stone quays of the Ribera, looking back at their city in ruins. Then, they noticed something strange. The water was disappearing. The earthquake had triggered a massive tsunami. About 40 minutes after the shaking stopped, a wall of water, estimated to be 20 to 30 feet high, came racing up the Tagus. It smashed into the riverfront, sweeping away the survivors, the lower floors of the palace, and the docks. But the nightmare was still not over. Remember the thousands of candles lit for All Saints' Day? They had fallen into the wooden ruins of the houses and churches. Within an hour, dozens of small fires merged into a firestorm. Because the streets were blocked by rubble and the water system was destroyed, the fire raged unchecked for 5 days. Lisbon didn't just fall, it was crushed, drowned, and then burned. The numbers are staggering. Out of a population of 200,000, it is estimated that between 30,000 and 60,000 people died. The physical loss was even more absolute. 85% of Lisbon's buildings were destroyed. The Ribeira Palace was gone. The Royal Library and its 70,000 books, burned. The archives of the great discoveries, lost forever. Paintings by Rubens and Titian, turned to ash. This is the Carmel Convent today. It was left in its ruined state as a memorial to the earthquake. When you stand inside it and look up at the open sky, you are seeing exactly what the survivors saw in Noviembre de 1755. It is a skeleton of a city that was once the richest in the world. The disaster shook more than just the ground, it shook the foundations of European thought. Philosophers like Rousseau and Voltaire debated, how could a good God allow such a tragedy on a holy day to a devout city? This event effectively ended the era of blind religious optimism and helped trigger the Age of Enlightenment. In the wake of the disaster, the king, José Joao's successor, was paralyzed by fear. He developed a phobia of living inside stone walls and spent the rest of his life living in a complex of luxury tents outside the city. The task of rebuilding fell to one man, the king's prime minister, the Marquis de Pombal. Legend has it that when asked what was to be done, Pombal replied simply, bury the dead and feed the living. Pombal was a man of the Enlightenment. He saw the destruction as an opportunity to build a rational city. He ignored the old property lines of the nobility and the church. He ordered the ruins cleared and designed a new city center, the Bassa Pombalina. He implemented the world's first earthquake-resistant building techniques. It required that every new building be tested using a gaola pombalina, the pombalin cage, a flexible wooden frame designed to sway but not break during a tremor. To test the design, he had soldiers march in sync around models of the buildings to simulate seismic waves. He also standardized the city. The beautiful azulejos, tiles, we see today on Lisbon's buildings were mass-produced under his orders to speed up the reconstruction. He replaced the narrow, filthy alleys of the medieval city with straight, wide boulevards that allowed for commerce, air, light, and the movement of troops. This is the result of Pombal's vision. The center of this new world was the Praça do Comércio, built on the exact site where the Ribeira Palace once stood. By naming it Commerce Square, Pombal was sending a message to the world. Portugal was no longer just a religious empire, it was a modern, mercantile nation. The Grand Arch, the Rua Augusta, served as a gateway from the sea into the heart of the new city. In the center of the square stands the bronze statue of the king, trampling snakes under his horse's hooves, a symbol of order triumphing over the chaos of the earthquake. Today, this square is the living room of Lisbon. It is one of the most beautiful plazas in Europe. When you walk here, you are walking on top of the site of the Great Tsunami, on top of the ruins of the old palace, and within the heart of a city that refused to die. Lisbon's history is a story of devastating lows and extreme highs. It rose as the queen of the seas, fell in a morning of water and fire, and was reborn as a city of the future. The 1700s began with the glitter of Brazilian gold and ended with the sober, elegant lines of Pombaline architecture. It was the century that saw Lisbon move from the medieval to the modern. Being the tourist shops and the grand facades, the spirit of the 18th century is still there. It's in the saudade asterisco, that uniquely Portuguese feeling of longing for something that was lost. It's in the defiant arches of the Carmo and the resilient stones of the Alfama. Lisbon is a city that has seen the end of the world and decided to keep going. It reminds us that even after the greatest tragedies, beauty can be rebuilt, strong, rational, and more enduring than before. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the tragic and golden history of Lisbon, let us know in the comments. Which city's secrets should we uncover next using our AI lens? Should we walk the marble halls of ancient Rome, or perhaps the streets of Edo period Japan? Thanks for watching. I'm Tim, and together, we'll keep history reborn. See you in the next era.